What if I told you that Raymond Burr, the legendary star Perry Mason, had a secret side few ever saw? Behind that calm, commanding presence was a man who quietly despised some of old Hollywood's biggest names. Today, we're diving into the hidden grudges and deep hatreds Burr carried against certain actors, revealing the dark, unspoken rivalries that shaped his career. This isn't just gossip. It's a glimpse behind the glamorous curtain of a ruthless industry, where friendships were fragile and enemies were everywhere. Stay tuned, because the truths Raymond Burr kept hidden might shock you. Raymond Burr was a towering figure in television history, best known for his portrayal of the resolute defense attorney in Perry Mason and the determined detective in Ironside. His commanding presence and authoritative voice made him a household name, embodying characters who stood for justice and integrity. To the public, Burr was the epitome of professionalism and dedication, often described as private yet deeply committed to his craft. PerryMasoNTVSeries.com. Behind the scenes, Burr was known for his meticulous preparation and unwavering work ethic. He reportedly lived in a bungalow on the studio lot during the filming of Perry Mason, rising at 3:30 a.m. to rehearse his courtroom monologues. Despite his success, Burr once reflected on the personal sacrifices his career demanded, expressing regret over the constraints it placed on his personal life. People.com. PerryMasoNTVSeries.com. While Burr's on-screen characters were paragons of virtue, his off-screen life was shrouded in mystery. He was known to be generous, hosting lavish dinner parties, and supporting numerous charitable causes. Yet, he remained intensely private, often deflecting questions about his personal life. This dichotomy between his public persona and private existence intrigued fans and colleagues alike, setting the stage for revelations that would emerge only after his passing. As we delve deeper into Burr's life, we'll uncover complexities and secrets that lay beneath his stoic exterior. The next section will explore the fabrications and myths that Burr constructed, shedding light on the lengths he went to protect his privacy. Raymond Burr was not just an actor, he was a master of illusion. Off-screen, he spun a personal narrative so complex and layered that even his closest fans were left baffled when the truth began to unravel. In countless interviews over the years, Burr spoke of heartbreaks and tragedies that seemed to give him a kind of tragic depth, stories that painted him as a man who had endured profound loss. But here's the twist. Almost none of it was true. According to Burr, he had been married 3 times. One of those wives, he claimed, was the actress Annette Sutherland, who he said died in a tragic plane crash while en route to work on a film. He also mentioned the second wife, Isabella Ward, and even spoke of a young son who died of leukemia at just 10 years old. These stories weren't shared for drama. Burr told them as quiet truths, as though they were the foundation of the emotional life he kept so closely guarded. But after Burr passed away in 1993, researchers and biographers began looking more closely at these claims. What they found was shocking. There was no record of a marriage to Annette Sutherland. In fact, no such person seemed to have existed in the film industry at all. The story of his son was equally unfounded. Public records, close colleagues, and even family friends found no evidence of a child. The only confirmed marriage, to Isabella Ward, lasted barely a year in the 1940s and ended in divorce. She later confirmed that they had not seen each other again after separating. These fabrications weren't just idle stories. They were calculated shields. They offered Burr protection from the spotlight's invasive glare and, more importantly, from a world that might not have accepted the truth about who he really was. In the conservative climate of 1950s and 60s Hollywood, being openly gay could destroy a career overnight. Studio heads were ruthless in maintaining the moral image of their stars, often going to great lengths to conceal any behavior that strayed from what was considered acceptable. Burr wasn't alone in constructing these personal myths. Many actors during the golden age of Hollywood lived double lives, forced to lie about who they loved, what they believed, and how they lived. But few did it as meticulously as Burr. The extent of his invented biography suggests a man who lived in constant fear, not of losing fame, but of losing safety, peace, and dignity. The fabricated stories served their purpose. They made him appear human and relatable, cloaking him in just enough sadness to explain his guarded personality. But they also left questions. Why go so far? What was he really protecting? And who, Exactly. Was Raymond Burr when the cameras weren't rolling? Next, we'll uncover the one truth Burr never shared with the public during his lifetime, the relationship that defined his personal life, and the man he spent over 3 decades with, quietly, lovingly, and in total secrecy. While Raymond Burr publicly spun tales of tragic marriages and lost children, behind the veil was a very real and quietly enduring love story, one he could never openly share. At the heart of it was a man named Robert Benavides, an actor-turned-producer and former Korean War veteran. The two met in the late 1950s, around the time Burr's fame was peaking as the unshakable Perry Mason. What followed was a relationship that lasted over 30 years, longer than most Hollywood marriages, but it existed entirely in the shadows. Benavides wasn't just a fleeting partner. He became a constant presence in Burr's life. They built a world together, one of shared interests, passions, and ambitions. The two owned and operated a vineyard in Dry Creek Valley, Sonoma County, where they produce award-winning wine under the label Raymond Burr Vineyards. They also ran an orchid business and worked together behind the scenes in production of Burr's later television projects, including Ironside and various Perry Mason TV movies. To those close to the couple, their bond was unmistakable, though never officially acknowledged as partners in public. Friends and colleagues understood their connection. They lived together, traveled together, built businesses together, and through it all, they kept up the facade required to avoid public scrutiny. Hollywood didn't reward honesty when it came to non-traditional relationships. Being outed in that era could mean blacklisting, loss of work, and permanent damage to one's reputation. It's important to understand the context of their decision to remain silent. Burr came from a generation and an industry that viewed homosexuality not just as taboo, but as dangerous. Rumors alone could derail an actor's career. For someone like Burr, who had carefully crafted a reputation built on seriousness and integrity, exposure would have threatened everything he'd worked for. And so, the truth stayed hidden. Even more telling is the fact that Burr never corrected the false narratives he created. He allowed the stories of lost wives and a deceased child persist, even as he shared his life, quietly and lovingly, with Benavides. Perhaps it was easier for the public to accept a grieving widower than to question the absence of traditional relationships in his life. Perhaps it was the only way Burr knew to protect both himself and the man he loved. When Burr died in 1993, he left nearly his entire estate to Benavides. There was no dramatic reveal, no confession letter, no deathbed interview, just a quiet passing of legacy from one partner to another. It was a final, silent act of a life lived cautiously and in many ways invisibly. But that wasn't the whole story. What makes Burr's life even more complicated is how his hidden truth coexisted with and was shaped by the harsh expectations of old Hollywood. Next, we'll dig deeper into the era that forced Raymond Burr and countless others into secrecy, and extreme length studios want to maintain the illusion. To understand why Raymond Burr went to such elaborate lengths to hide his personal life, you have to understand the world he was trying to survive in. Old Hollywood wasn't just glamorous. It was ruthless. Studios didn't just make movies. They created myths. And if a real-life star didn't fit the image they wanted to sell, they were rebranded, rewritten, or erased. In the 1950s and 60s, Hollywood studios had immense control over their talent. Actors were essentially owned by the studio system, bound by restrictive contracts that dictated what roles they played, how they dressed in public, who they were seen with, and how they spoke to press. Personal freedom was a luxury few could afford, especially if they deviated from the studio-approved mold. One of the most chilling aspects of this control was how the studios handled actors who were suspected of being gay. Homosexuality at the time wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered a career-ending scandal. Actors caught in compromising situations could be blacklisted overnight to protect their investments. Studios often arranged what came to be known as lavender marriages, fake heterosexual relationships between stars, designed solely to fend off suspicion and rumors. In this environment, a man like Raymond Burr, deeply private and at odds with the rigid expectations of masculinity and heterosexuality, had very few options. Rather than submit to a studio-crafted relationship or risk exposure, he chose to write his own story. He created fictitious marriages. He invented a deceased son. He built a protective barrier of tragedy that would keep people from prying too deeply. It wasn't just about protecting his own career, either. Being publicly outed could have led to arrest, public disgrace, or even institutionalization. The very real threat of losing everything, reputation, livelihood, dignity, hung over every move he made. Silence wasn't just a choice, it was survival. This culture didn't just affect Burr. It was systemic. Tab Hunter, Rock Hudson, Anthony Perkins, all were forced to hide their identities behind smiles and fake romances. For many, this dual life created immense emotional strain. Burr's stoic public persona may have been part of his natural temperament, but was also likely a coping mechanism, a way to maintain control when everything else had to be hidden. The public never saw the cost. They saw the powerful lawyer, the brilliant detective, the commanding presence on screen. They didn't see the emotional toll of a life lived in half-truths. But those truths, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing, even decades later. What's more haunting is how these circumstances shaped the way Burr viewed the industry and the people in it. Next, we'll explore the quiet resentments that began to brew beneath the surface, and how Burr's feelings toward other actors in Hollywood revealed a deeper, more personal frustration. Raymond Burr was a man who mastered control over his image, his narrative, and his emotions. But beneath that controlled surface was a simmering frustration, especially toward a certain type of actor, the showboats, the gossips, and the ones who play by the rules of the Hollywood popularity game. While he rarely voiced his opinions in public, those close to him knew. There were certain names that, when mentioned, would cause his entire mood to shift. Burr never named names in interviews. He was too guarded, too calculating for that. But in private conversations and through subtle shifts in behavior, patterns began to emerge. He had little patience for actors who he believed coasted on charm or looks while lacking depth or discipline. Burr saw himself as a serious actor. He had trained, studied, and taken the craft seriously. So when others, particularly the so-called matinee idols of the time, gained praise for minimal effort, it visibly irritated him. One name that surfaced often was Errol Flynn. Flynn, known for his wild off-screen lifestyle and swashbuckling roles, was everything Burr was not. Flamboyant, reckless, and celebrated for his chaos. Burr, who kept his private life fiercely hidden, viewed Flynn's public antics as reckless indulgence. He once reportedly said to a colleague that actors like Flynn got away with murder, while the rest of them had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. Burr also held quiet disdain for actors who used gossip to elevate their own standing. In an industry that thrived on whisper networks and planted stories, Burr's preference for silence made him a target. He distrusted actors who mingled too eagerly with the press or who fed off public adoration. In his eyes, that kind of behavior cheapened the work. It wasn't just about being an actor, it was about being respected. And respect, to Burr, wasn't something you bought with magazine covers or studio parties. But his resentment wasn't just professional. It was also deeply personal. Burr saw firsthand how some actors played along with the system, entering sham marriages, performing hypermasculinity, and throwing others under the bus to protect themselves. Burr never did that. He chose invisibility over betrayal, and he watched with quiet fury as others climbed higher by doing the opposite. There were even tensions on the set of Perry Mason. Though Burr was admired by many of his co-stars, he was known to shut down conversations he found trivial or gossipy. He could be icy toward guest stars who didn't take the work seriously, and there were rumors that he blacklisted actors he considered unprofessional or untrustworthy. What made his bitterness sting even deeper was the hypocrisy. The actors who rubbed shoulders with power players and bent the truth were often rewarded. Meanwhile, Burr lived behind layers of fiction and pain, never able to be fully himself, and watching others succeed by playing a completely different game. But what happened when Burr's quiet hatred turned into something more direct? Next up, we'll explore the behind-the-scenes conflicts and cold feuds that nearly boiled over, and the few actors who found themselves on Burr's bad side for good. Raymond Burr didn't believe in public outbursts. He wasn't the kind of actor to flip tables, shout down directors, or storm off sets. His brand of confrontation was quieter, more surgical. But when he disliked someone, you felt it. And when he decided someone didn't belong in his world, they disappeared from it completely. On the set of Perry Mason, Burr was known for his intense focus and unrelenting commitment to the role. He memorized pages of courtroom dialogue word for word, often helping less prepared guest stars run lines between takes. But if someone showed up late, didn't know their lines, or treated material like fluff, Burr took it as a personal insult. He wasn't afraid to voice his disappointment in subtle but unmistakable ways. There's one particularly infamous story of a guest actor, unnamed in most accounts, who arrived on set acting as though the show was beneath him. Burr reportedly said nothing during the rehearsal, but the next morning, the actor was gone. Recast. No explanation. According to one crew member, Burr simply said, "We don't have time for people who think this is a joke." No shouting, no drama. Just gone. This wasn't a one-off. Over the years, Burr quietly blacklisted more than a few actors from his sets. He couldn't stop them from getting roles elsewhere, but if you crossed him, if you mocked the seriousness of the work, or worse, gossiped about his private life, you were never invited back. One studio insider even suggested that Burr kept a do not work with list, though it was never made official. He didn't need to write it down. He remembered, but it wasn't just about unprofessionalism. There were actors Burr deeply resented for more personal reasons. Some, he believed, had gone out of their way to mock or question his masculinity, a sensitive topic given how carefully he hid his sexuality. Others had passed along rumors about his private life to studio heads or reporters, playing a dangerous game that could have cost him everything. These weren't just enemies. They were threats. And then there were the actors who, in Burr's eyes, were rewarded for mediocrity. He never said their names in public, but he seethed when lesser talents were praised for roles that required more posing and acting. Some of these men became stars because they fit Hollywood's preferred mold. Clean-cut, charming, outwardly all-American. Burr saw through the act, and it infuriated him. They played the part. He played the truth, and he had to lie to survive. What made Burr's quiet fury even more potent was that he held all the power, especially on Perry Mason. He was the face of the show. If he didn't want you on set, you weren't on it. If you got on his bad side, your career wouldn't be over, but it'd take a hit. And Burr never forgot. But this cold professionalism masked something deeper, not just frustration, but exhaustion. Burr was fighting battles on all sides, against a system that rejected him, against actors who played the game better, and against himself. And that strain, it took its toll. We'll look at the toll fame and secrecy took on Burr's mental and physical health, and how years of bottled-up resentment and isolation eventually began to crack his carefully controlled image. By the late 1960s, Raymond Burr had achieved what most actors only dreamed of: massive fame, critical respect, and a place in television history. But the price of that success wasn't something the public could see. Beneath the carefully managed public image was a man burdened by decades of secrets, bitterness, and quiet suffering. And as the years went on, the weight of that silence began to show. Physically, Burr bore the stress in a way few people realized. His health declined steadily in his later years, the result of both genetics and a high-stress lifestyle. He battled chronic pain, obesity, and recurring illnesses, many of which he downplayed in public. Behind the scenes, those close to him described a man who was often in discomfort but refused to let it show. His work ethic didn't slow down, even as his body began to, but the emotional toll was harder to mask. While Burr remained fiercely loyal to Robert Benavides and maintained a sense of control over his personal affairs, those close to him say there were moments, rare but telling, when the facade cracked. One friend described Burr in his later years as haunted and tired of pretending. He had spent most of his life weaving protective lies and dodging invasive questions. That kind of constant defense wears a person down. It wasn't just the secrecy about his sexuality that weighed on him. Burr carried a deep emotional burden from decades of betrayal, fake friendships, and opportunists who tried to leverage his trust for their own gain. He had learned early on to question people's motives, especially in Hollywood, and it left him deeply guarded. Trust didn't come easily, and once it was broken, it was rarely repaired. Despite his visible success, Burr often spoke of loneliness. Not directly, but in the way people who've been lonely too long learn to hint without confessing. He didn't attend many Hollywood parties. He avoided the spotlight when he could. And although he had a tight circle of trusted colleagues and friends, few truly knew him. He had lived so much of his life playing roles, both on screen and off, that the real Raymond Burr became harder to access, even for himself. Some have speculated that Burr's legendary generosity, funding college scholarships, supporting charities, and helping people anonymously, was his way of compensating for the emotional walls he had to build. He gave freely to others, perhaps because he knew how much it hurt to live in a world that wouldn't accept who he really was. By the time he reprised Perry Mason in the late 80s for a series of TV movies, Burr was a different man. Physically heavier, visibly fatigued, but still sharp, still commanding. He never addressed the rumors. He never rewrote the lies. Even as the world around him changed and became slightly more accepting, he stayed rooted in the silence he'd lived in for decades. But his silence was never passive. It was armor, and under that armor, the damage was real. Raymond Burr wasn't just a television icon. He was a man who played the long game in a world that rarely played fair. While others chased fame with flash and scandal, Burr built something deeper, a legacy grounded in talent, discipline, and quiet defiance. He never exposed his enemies. He never publicly lashed out at the actors he couldn't stand or the system that forced him into silence. Instead, he chose control. He chose privacy. And in doing so, he exposed a different kind of power, the kind that doesn't need the last word to win. But looking back, it's clear Burr's life wasn't just shaped by the roles he played on screen, but by the ones he had to play off it. The grieving husband, the straight leading man, the stoic mentor. Roles he didn't ask for, roles he didn't deserve, but roles he wore anyway, to survive. In a time when so many actors were forced to choose between truth and career, Burr made his choice. And while it cost him more than most people will ever know, it also gave him something rare in Hollywood, lasting respect. Because at the end of the day, Raymond Burr wasn't just a man who solved every case on Perry Mason. He was the case, a mystery wrapped in silence, hidden in plain sight. And now that the truth is finally out, one thing is certain. Raymond Burr didn't just endure old Hollywood. He outlived it. And the story he left behind is more revealing than any script he ever read. Thanks for sticking with me through the hidden story of Raymond Burr and the old Hollywood actors he quietly despised. It's a reminder that behind every legend, there's a complex, often untold story. If you found this video eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into Hollywood's untold secrets. And don't forget to ring the bell. See you next time.